Hi, and thank you for joining me. I'm Dr. Adam Scouse. I'm a postdoctoral teaching scholar in the Department of Forest Biomaterials here at NC State. And today, we're going to look at the bioeconomy, the economic impacts that it creates, and why it matters. So here's what I'm hoping that you take away from this lecture. We're going to cover a lot of material today, but I really want you to walk away with an understanding of how large the bioeconomy is in North Carolina and understand the different types of economic impacts it creates: direct, indirect, and induced. So remember those three terms. And really what I want you to understand is that when you spend a dollar on something, on a good or a service, that dollar spent creates economic impacts that really ripple through the economy in a circular nature. And that's what I really want you to understand today. And we're going to talk about the different factors that change kind of the relative size of that ripple effect. We began the course looking at this USDA 2016 report, and it summarized the bioeconomy in all the 50 states. But here in North Carolina, we can see up here in the top right that the bioeconomy directly employs 90,000 people. Those are direct economic impacts. So that means 90,000 people working in manufacturing plants and in jobs directly related to the bioeconomy. But when we look at the total jobs it creates, it's somewhere around 180,000. So that includes all the types of people that are working throughout the supply chains and that are working in other businesses that support businesses in the bioeconomy. So really we understand that economic impacts are measured from different perspectives, right? It's both a direct perspective here as well as the induced perspective, which is the total jobs, 180,000 in this case. So let's expand on this concept and let's talk about a hypothetical sawmill in North Carolina. Let's just say it exists somewhere in eastern North Carolina and then it employs, roughly 50 people. So that sawmill is going to have a supporting supply chain, right? People to deliver logs to the mill, companies that ship the finished lumber to stores, retail facilities. And each one of those companies is also employing people. Now, all the employees at the mill and through the supply chain, they go out and they spend their money at grocery stores or maybe to have a nice dinner. And in each one of those spots, those businesses are also employing people, right? They're saving up for paying their health care or maybe to take a vacation or to put tires on their vehicle. So if we think about the economy from this perspective, if we look just at the sawmill and the people that are employed there, those are direct economic impacts. But when we consider the entire supply chain and we talk about employment and revenue and output throughout the whole supply chain, those are indirect economic impacts. And lastly, when we think about all the different goods and services that are being bought because the employees at the sawmill and throughout the supply chain are spending their wages, those are the separate induced economic impacts. So if we go back and think about that report, the bioeconomy directly created an output of $6.4 billion. But if we look at all the impacts that it creates, it's much larger, something around $13.6 billion. Okay, so now let's try to dive deeper into this economic ripple effect, so to speak. So the way that economists calculate the economic impacts of a business or an economy, they use these multipliers shown here. Okay, so 1.87. What that means is that for every dollar that is spent on a good or a service, that dollar spent creates an additional 87 cents of economic activity that ripples through the economy. Okay, so we can look at, I've got an example here of computer manufacturing in Austin, Texas to kind of illustrate this point, right? So to begin, there is some kind of activity, some spending that initiates the economic impacts, right? That's like dropping the pebble into the pond to create the ripples. So that initial dollar spent right here, that's final demand change. So that's a dollar spent on manufactured computers. But what we can see is that that dollar creates somewhere around 52 cents worth of additional economic activity. So that 52 cents of additional economic activity then goes to ripple on and generate somewhere around, 24 cents of activity. So what we can do is we can add up all the impacts that are created by that dollar of final demand change. And when you sum everything up underneath this red line, that's how you get your economic multiplier. So this concept can be attributed to Francois Quesnay. He's shown here. And Quesnay was really started off as a doctor. He was apprenticing as a surgeon. And he thought about the economy a lot like he thought about how blood flows through the body. And he was the first to recognize the circular nature of the economy. And he does so in his publication, the Tableau Économique. And so he's kind of the first one that gets credit for recognizing that when you spend a dollar in certain places, that dollar gets respent. Now that circular nature of the economy, that concept was picked up and further developed by this Nobel Prize winning economist, Wassily Leontief. He worked in the 30s and 40s at Harvard and also with the US government to help strategize and plan how to grow the economy to deal with stresses that were caused by World War II. They needed to know, okay, well, what industries really need to be developed in order to support the war effort? Probably steel, probably medical. Okay, well, if those industries are going to grow, what other industries also need to grow alongside of it? So they were doing a bit of economic planning. And in order to kind of put a mathematical model to that, he developed input-output tables here. And so I've got one shown. It's right here. It's an input-output table. And what he's doing is down the columns, he's listing an industry and what that industry needs to buy from other industries in order to make their goods and services. And then along the rows, he lists out what an industry sells and where they sell that to other industries. And so when you list out kind of the interactions that are taking place in the economy in this way, in this table, you can do some linear algebra and you can create a whole table of those economic multipliers. And that table becomes basically a snapshot of the economy. And it can then be used to model different demand changes, and you can ask questions. You can say, okay, if housing starts were to grow by 10%, what might we expect the demand increase to be in the transportation sector? So you can do all this kind of interesting question asking and research with these input-output tables. So economic impact modeling is a really important part of economic planning. And one great example of this is the way that the Forest Service uses input-output tables and input-output analysis to make and approve land management plans. So the Forest Service basically has to develop land management plans for basically 5-year chunks based on what they're planning to do with the timber that they harvest from their forests. And they need to determine, okay, well, how is that going to impact local residents? What type of jobs might it create? What businesses does it support? And so to do so, the Forest Service worked in conjunction with some software developers to create InPlan. InPlan's a great software tool. It takes really data-heavy input-output tables and then combines it with a really nice user-friendly upfront kind of interface, and you can use that software to create economic impact assessments. Okay, so let's think about economic planning in the context of North Carolina, just as an idea. And we'll talk specifically about the Outer Banks. The Outer Banks always is struggling with the hurricane season, right? It can be devastating, knocks out homes, businesses, and so you might consider hurricanes as a really large economic hurdle to have to plan around. So if you're a policy leader in the Outer Banks and you want to think about growing the economy in a sustainable way, how do you want to encourage economic growth? And you can think about it. Okay, do we want to encourage tourism so that people are coming to the Outer Banks and spending their dollars and injecting our economy with that spending? And as a result, do we want to bolster maybe food and beverage facilities there in the area, right? Encourage restaurants? Or maybe you want to take a different approach. Maybe you want to encourage industry. Maybe you've got access to local shipping routes, or you've got available natural resources that could be utilized in manufacturing and that you want to take advantage of. Or maybe you want to go a different route. Maybe you want to create some kind of tax incentive program that creates advantages for, say, tech firms, that cause tech firms to relocate to the Outer Banks and set up shop there. And that way they're creating jobs and creating employment opportunities for people in the area that aren't just tourism based. So traditionally we think about these strategies in the way that they create jobs and tax revenue and their growth potential. But obviously there's a lot more to consider when we think about the three pillars of sustainability. And if we think about the economic pillar of sustainability, we want to make sure that the jobs and the economy that we're promoting creates livable wages. It gives opportunities for those employees to invest their money in retirement, and it allows them to be able to afford adequate housing. If we think about it from the environmental pillar, we want to know that obviously water quality is going to be a big deal in the Outer Banks. Plus, there's also an abundant amount of pine that grows around the Outer Banks. Maybe there's an opportunity to use, but also we need to protect that resource in a sustainable way, right? Replanting after harvesting, make sure that we're practicing forestry in a way that promotes wildlife health and land health. We also want to think about maybe the recycling infrastructure of the state and whether that needs to be further developed according to our strategy. And then lastly, from the social perspective, we want to make sure, particularly because healthcare is tied to employment, that the jobs that we're creating can provide healthcare, maybe that they encourage educational attainment, support the goals of those employees, and that the companies and businesses that we're building and attracting are going to, participate in the community. Okay, so I want to take this slide really just to illustrate, what impact assessments look like. And so I've got two different ones shown here, and we'll look first at the top. This is a very simple kind of economic estimate based on, expecting tourism associated with pedestrians and bicyclists. So they, expect that will increase by, 40% from out-of-state residents. And they know, based on the surveys that they've conducted, that an average trip that those tourists are spending somewhere around $60 per trip. So, okay, that's going to generate somewhere around $68 million for the local economy. So that's one way to do these impact assessments. But we can also use the economic multipliers, which are shown here below. So this is kind of a more dense table, maybe not so friendly to read, but let's go through this. I'll walk you how to read it. So the way that we read this table is saying that for every $100,000 that is spent at a nonprofit's art and cultural center, that creates, as a national average, somewhere around 2.7 full-time equivalent jobs. But if you were to spend that same $100,000 in the state of North Carolina, it some reason generates 3 jobs. So what's the difference there? Well, there can be a lot of things that influence that. The localness of the businesses, who they're employing throughout their supply chains. And so, what I'm trying to illustrate here is that certain industries can have a larger economic impact. And so, it might be a benefit for policymakers and researchers to think about, what industries really fit well with our state based on the resources that we have, based on the businesses that already exist here, and develop strategies around that. Okay, here's a really interesting example of economic development strategy. I'll talk about cross-laminated timber in the Pacific Northwest. So cross-laminated timber is basically where you take lumber and you glue it together to create these massive wooden building elements, basically. And you can kind of use them in a prefabricated nature and put them together like Lego bricks. And when you use that building style, you can actually create buildings that are much taller than they traditionally would be than if you used regular, wood framing architecture styles. So researchers have been working real hard to, promote and develop building codes related to CLT. And the Pacific Northwest is really interested in using CLT because they recognize that they've got a lot of Douglas fir that's growing in the area. And they also used to have a fairly strong wood product sector, which has been experiencing decline. So what they've done is they've created an economic impact statement that said, okay, well, if we expect that the CLT market grows, and it grows to represent something about 15% of the demand for softwood lumber, then we expect that growth can stimulate roughly 7,000 jobs directly. So that's in manufacturing plants making CLT. But when we consider all the supply chain elements that need to be incorporated in, like adhesive manufacturers and shipping companies and all those gentlemen or ladies out in the forest that are knocking down those trees, it grows to about 14,000. And when we think about all of those workers going out and spending their money in the local economy at restaurants and laundromats and supporting other businesses and having those employees going out and spend their money, it actually is supporting somewhere around 20,000 jobs. Okay, so a really interesting component of this is looking at different industries and how they create economic impacts. So I'm going to compare two industries. We're going to look at forestry, and we're going to compare that to paper making. And so these are two industries that would generally be lumped together in forest products. But I really want to highlight here how different they can be in creating economic impacts. So I've used some survey data to create these distributions. And if we look at the wages that are paid to workers in these two industries and where they end up, we see some big differences. Those workers out in the forest that are harvesting logs, the wages that they earn end up in households mostly in the $50,000 to $75,000 range. Now, when we talk about paper manufacturing, which you might consider more high skilled, maybe you would need a college degree to get that job, that industry is actually paying wages in a structure that looks more like this. So you've got more employees that are making more money, or at least those wages end up in higher income households. And that's going to have a pretty drastic impact on economic impacts. Here's why. We know that how much money you make impacts where that money is spent. So here is a look at some household expenditure averages. And so we can look at the different household income categories. We can see where they're spending their money. And obviously, as you make more income, you spend your money in different places. And the amount of money that you spend on your house drastically increases, along with the type of food that you buy. And so, what jobs that you create in your economic growth strategy really matters in determining the types of economic impacts that will result. And that's based on our consumer behaviors, based on how much money we're making. Okay, I want to further dive into the differences between different industries in creating economic impacts. So what I'm showing here is a table of multipliers. So we'll talk about wood products manufacturing specifically. So this is a multiplier that represents how much money is created for households based on a dollar spent in that industry. So for every dollar that's spent in wood products, it creates 45 cents of earnings to households. And the earnings mostly end up here in high-income households. Another large portion ends up in mid-income households, and then a very small portion down here in low-income households. And you can see how these economic impacts change from industry to industry. And that is really based on a lot of factors. Where is the industry buying its inputs? Are they buying from local businesses? Are they importing goods from outside the US? Right? All these types of things are going to impact the multipliers. So another topic that I want to discuss is the locality of businesses and why that matters. So we already looked at similar charts like these earlier in the presentation. And now we're going to compare two different industries. We're going to compare computer manufacturing and professional services. I'm going to show you why locality of businesses matter, right? So you have a dollar's worth of final demand change in each industry, right? And that dollar spent creates 50 cents in computer manufacturing, but it creates somewhere around 27 cents in the professional services industry. That's people like architects and engineers. Okay, but what we're showing here in this light blue is how much of that money is spent not in the local economy, but outside the local economy. So you can think about those as dollars being spent maybe overseas, right? When you purchase a product and that product has to be imported, say, from Italy, right? That money is leaving your pocket and going to an economy outside of your region. So that basically illustrates, local purchasing power. And so this difference, right, the difference between how much is happening locally in the dark blue versus the light blue, how much is spent outside the region, this is called economic leakage, right? That's money that you're spending that doesn't really ripple through the economy. So when we compare these two industries and consider only the impacts created at the local level, they're actually very similar, although their multipliers might look different. So to further illustrate this, I want to talk about bioeconomy-based sectors, right? And we're going to look at the overall value of output they create over here, as well as employment multipliers. So when we look at the bioeconomy, its output multiplier is right up here at 1.91. And when we compare that to other non-bioeconomy businesses, it's about 2.9. So it's a little bit smaller in that respect. So what it's saying is that the output that's generated through spending in the bioeconomy is not necessarily as high as other non-bioeconomy sectors. But when we look at the employment that it creates, it's a little bit higher. And so I pulled this study, which looks at countries from the EU, just because I've got data for that. I don't necessarily have United States specific data, although I would love it. We want to look at how bioeconomy-based sectors change from country to country. You can see that France actually has one of the largest bioeconomy based output multipliers. And we can compare that to maybe Germany, which has much smaller. So I basically bring this up to recognize that there might be certain countries that could benefit more greatly by implementing bioeconomy-based growth strategies. Okay, so now I really want to highlight the importance of economic diversity. When you're making a strategy about growing your region's economy, you really want to prioritize diversity, because diversity is what makes an economy robust. We can think about, here I've got a picture of the Midwest, and we can think about the auto industry in the Midwest, right? That was a very concentrated industry segment in that area. And so when the market crash happened, I think it was 2009, that area suffered really greatly because so much of their economy was tied up in auto manufacturing, which took a hit. So having a diverse economy really helps protect you from these surprises that can pop up and helps you, remain robust. And so here's an example of the different diversity indexes for each state. Now, I can't really speak to why Pennsylvania and Georgia and Arizona are considered more economically diverse, but I do just want to highlight that it changes from state to state, and that the economic diversity is a measurable index where we can compare the relative diversity of businesses that exist within these states. Okay, so that wraps up my lecture. I really appreciate you sticking it out with me. And here's what I hope you learned. I hope that you learned that the bioeconomy is contributing to economic growth in a real and tangible way, and that it's an exciting way to think about growing the economy in a sustainable way. I hope that you've also taken away that bioeconomy-based businesses, that they provide a level of employment and they generate output in a similar nature to other businesses, right? It's not like we're sacrificing jobs or economic output by prioritizing the bioeconomy. It's not that. And I also wanted to highlight that buying local really can have a large impact in boosting the impact of your spending, right? So it's just an argument for buying local. And then, what businesses offer in terms of wages and benefits, that also really, drastically can change the type of economic impacts that are created. So that's something to think about when you're creating an economic growth strategy. Do you want to encourage jobs with high salaries and great benefits so that those dollars can continue to be respent throughout the economy? Lastly, diversity matters. It's important to not grow one sector in particular, but really to diversify a strategy so that it is capable of handling all the chaotic events that can happen and that will really, can be unforeseen. So with that, thanks so much for joining me, and I wish you luck in the rest of the course.